Early on the morning of January 12th, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Portufis sat up suddenly in his bed, breathing hard. The room was pitch black that he was in, but he could feel he was sweating and his heart was racing, and he tried to shake his head to kind of wipe the nightmare he had just had from his mind, but he just couldn't do it. All he could think about was how in this nightmare, something had been chasing him, and he had been running for his life, and he was trying to get away, but whatever this thing was, this horrible beast that was following him, it just kept getting closer and closer and closer until it finally got him, and that's what woke him up. Jacques reached up and touched his face, and he realized he was crying, and he quickly wiped the tears away because he didn't want any of his brothers or sisters to see that he was crying. Jacques was the oldest of 8 kids in his family, and all of them slept in the same small room on straw-filled mattresses inside of their family's little cottage in the southern French province of Gévaudan. And so, Jacques, he's looking around the bedroom to make sure none of his siblings had woken up and seen him in this state, and he was relieved to see that they were all still fast asleep. Everybody made fun of Jacques for being a scaredy cat, for being a coward. And to Jacques, this really hurt his feelings because on some level, he knew it was kind of true. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, he had lost in a physical fight with a much younger boy, and afterwards, Jacques had cried, and the whole town had seen this happen, and so afterward, all the kids began calling Jacques the wet chicken, and even Jacques' brothers and sisters began joining in and calling him the wet chicken, and really making him feel totally ashamed. And it wasn't like the adults in this village were stepping up and protecting Jacques, because to them, Jacques was kind of like a liability. In this part of France, the winters were brutal. People died all the time in this village from the weather. And then the summers brought all these outbreaks of disease, which wiped out even more people in this village. And so by and large, where Jacques lived, it was kind of like the survival of the fittest. And many kids didn't live that long unless they were really hardy and tough, like their parents who had managed to survive for that long. But Jacques was just not like that. He was very gentle and peaceful, yet somehow he had survived. And Jacques really was not trying to become this kind of macho guy. Instead, he really wanted to be a priest, like his uncle. But his uncle lived far away, and so it was tough to see his uncle all that often, to learn about, how to become a priest. But anytime Jacques did get a chance to actually see his uncle, he would have a chance to read all these books and study alongside his uncle. And so for a little while, it was like Jacques was transported away from the hardships of his village to the life that in many ways he wished he had. A quiet, peaceful, very studious life. But deep down, Jacques felt like there was no chance he would ever actually escape this little village where he effectively was an outcast. Even though the sun had not risen yet, Jacques just sat on his bed and couldn't fall asleep again after waking up from this nightmare. And so just sitting there in the dark and the quiet, Jacques began to think about what he had to do later that day when the sun did come up. And like usual, Jacques started to feel afraid. And so Jacques eventually just laid down with his eyes open, and he laid there until dawn when one of his younger brothers, named Jean, who was 8 years old, rolled over and pushed him and said, "Hey, wet chicken, it's time to get up. It's our day with the sheep. Let's go." Jacques scowled at his younger brother and shoved him back, but not that hard, because Jacques never really shoved anybody that hard, no matter what they did to him. And then both boys hopped out of their bed, they wolfed down some bread and cheese, and then headed out the door. As soon as they were outside, Jacques noticed that the village was much quieter than it normally was. But then again, these days, villagers did not leave their homes unless they absolutely had to. And so Jacques and Jean made their way away from their cottage down the dirt road to the pen where their family kept all of their sheep. And the boys opened up the gate and then used their staffs to kind of corral the sheep out of the gate back onto the road. And as the sheep kind of bleated and baaed and bumped into each other, the boys worked hard to kind of organize them on the road. And then once the sheep understood which direction they were going, towards the forest, a very familiar walk for the sheep, they kind of fell into line and just began walking very casually, like they knew exactly where to go. And once the sheep had fallen into this kind of routine rhythm, Jacques and Jean fell in behind them and just walked quietly after them. And as the boys walked, they both constantly kept looking left and right and ahead of the sheep and behind them, constantly scanning for danger, because they knew something was out here. For months now, children all across this province in France, Gévaudan, had been going missing. They'd go off into fields or pastures, like when they're moving their family's livestock around, and the kids would just vanish. And then sometimes, if they were found again, they'd be found totally mutilated far from where they should have been. The attacks on these kids across Gévaudan had begun a year earlier on June 30th, 1764. On that day, a 14-year-old girl, who actually was the older sister of one of Jacques' friends, had disappeared and then been found again later that day, partially eaten in a field near her home after she had not come home with the family's cattle. Now, of course, this was very tragic, but to this point, there had not been any other attacks, so there was no pattern here, and so the assumption was she must have been attacked by a wolf, which did happen, and often two children, because kids at this time in France were often in charge of tending to their family's grazing animals, the way Jacques and Jean were going out with their sheep. You know, these kids were small, they couldn't really defend themselves, and if a wolf set onto them, there was very little they could do. But 5 weeks after this 14-year-old girl was found dead and mutilated in the field, 2 more teenagers were also found mutilated and dead in a field. And really, this was only the beginning. As summer turned to fall that year, more and more kids went missing and then turned up dead in fields, partially mutilated. And the more these attacks happened across southern France, the more people thought to themselves, this can't be a wolf. Number one, wolves don't go on extended human killing sprees. That's just not a thing. And number two, if it was a wolf, they would be eating more of their victims. They wouldn't just rip their body to shreds and then leave them. They would eat the meat. And so by this early January day in 1765, as Jacques and Jean were setting out for the day with their family's sheep, the death toll from whatever was killing these kids was now well into the dozens. People in France had begun calling whatever was killing these children the Beast of Gévaudan, and stories about this creature began popping up in newspapers all over France. People all across southern France began forming these huge hunting parties to go out into the forests and the wilds of Gévaudan to find this creature and kill it, but they would always come back empty-handed. And then every now and again, a hunter would be out and they would see a huge wolf and they would kill it and they would declare that they had found and killed the Beast of Gévaudan. But the attacks on these kids all across this province just continued. So obviously that wolf was not it. And so as these attacks continued, all the fairs and festivals that normally would pop up all year long, all across southern France, those all stopped because people were afraid to go out in fear of this creature. And then of course, in villages like Jacques' village, people really just stopped going out unless they had to, again, because of the Beast of Gévaudan. But Jacques and Jean's family relied on their livestock and they needed their sheep to go out and graze. And so on this day in January, Jacques and Jean had to go out because their sheep had to graze. Their family relied on the sheep, livestock was their livelihood, and so this was a mandatory thing. As Jacques and Jean continued walking behind their herd of sheep down this dirt road towards the forest, the two boys eventually came to a stop and just turned around and looked back at their village, and they saw walking on the road towards them were 5 more kids, along with 2 additional herds of sheep that these 5 kids were in charge of. Ever since the Beast of Gévaudan had become a thing, Jacques and Jean had begun tending their sheep along with these 5 kids and their sheep. They figured the bigger their group was, the safer they were from this creature. As the 5 kids got closer to Jacques and Jean, Jacques realized that one of the kids that was with them this day was a tall, thin redhead. It was the same younger boy who had recently beaten Jacques up in front of the village, and he had cried and everyone had made fun of him. And so Jacques sees this kid coming and immediately he can feel his face burning with embarrassment. And then the boy, he sees Jacques and he immediately smirks and begins flapping his arms like chicken wings. But once these 5 kids and their sheep joined Jacques and Jean and their sheep, they all kind of just went quiet because none of them wanted to be out there. They were all scared of the Beast of Gévaudan, and the only reason they were together was, again, to be safe from this creature that was killing kids left and right. And so, in relative silence, all of the kids and their sheep just slowly walked together down this dirt path, and eventually they made it into the big forest, where just beyond the forest was the pasture where these sheep would graze. And as the group actually entered into the trees and it became dark and more quiet and kind of eerie, Jean actually tugged on Jacques' shoulder and said, will you please tell a story? Because Jean was scared too. The kids were all scared, and they figured, if Jacques just told a story, it would take their mind off of how tense this moment was. And when Jacques heard this request, he actually smiled, because this was something he loved to do. He was a great storyteller. It was like his one strength. When Jean had asked for the story, the kids and the sheep had actually made it to really the end of the forest path. And so by the time Jacques was about to start his story, all the sheep had made their way out of the forest onto this big open pasture right in the middle of the forest. And so as the sheep just kind of filtered out into this open area, Jacques stopped, and all the kids kind of came up right behind him. And Jacques started his story by pointing across the pasture to this bog that was right at the base of this big hill. And he said, do you see those big rocks in that bog over there? Well, you see the biggest rock? Well, that's not really a rock. It's actually a doorway. And if you move the rock underneath it, there's a portal to another world. And so as Jacques began telling this very creative story about this kingdom that existed underneath the bog, he sat down against a rock, kind of facing out towards the sheep, and all the other kids kind of filed in around him, taking seats, with Jean, his brother, sitting right behind him to his right. And Jacques, he was just really into the story to the point where he kind of forgot about what was happening with the sheep, and he wasn't scanning around for danger, and neither were any of the kids, including the redhead who had beaten Jacques up. He wanted to act like he wasn't into his story, but in reality, he totally was, and he was just as interested in what was going on with the magical kingdom below this rock. And finally, when Jacques got to the end of his story, where this evil giant that had been tormenting the kingdom under the bog had been tricked by an orphan to try to go through this magical portal into their world, and the giant had gotten stuck in the doorway because he was so big, and he never tormented the kingdom again, and they lived happily ever after. When Jacques got to that point in the story and all the kids are totally locked in and not paying attention to anything else, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was, even though Jacques is telling the story and focusing on that, in the back of his mind, he registers hearing the sound of twigs breaking somewhere right behind him, almost like the sound of someone or something moving along the forest floor. And the second thing that happened was the red-headed kid who had beaten up Jacques, without saying a word, just stood up and began sprinting towards the pasture. And for a moment, Jacques thought this kid, who was kind of like a bully, was doing this on purpose, to be rude to Jacques, to kind of run away at the climax of the story like he didn't care about it. But then Jacques realized that he smelled something terrible behind him. But when Jacques turned around to see what was making this smell, he saw that his brother, Jean, who had been sitting right behind him to his right, was now gone, and where he had been sitting was just his staff laying on the ground. And for a second, Jacques just couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. He didn't understand how his brother could have gotten away from him without him noticing. But before Jacques could do anything, all the kids around him that were still there began screaming and pointing up towards this hill that was right behind them. And so Jacques turned around, and to his horror, he saw there was this huge 12-foot tall creature that was covered in fur. It looked like an oversized wolf, but it was standing on two legs, and its bones seemed like they were too big for its own skin, and it made it seem very angular and jagged. And as it kind of loped grotesquely up the hillside, Jacques realized it was carrying in its front arm Jean, who was screaming and kicking but could not get away from this creature. Jacques understood that this was the beast of Gévaudan, and it was going to go kill his brother. And immediately Jacques is thinking, you gotta run away, get to safety, get out of here. And all the kids around him, that's what they did. They took off running towards the pasture. They didn't care about Jean, they only cared about themselves. And so Jacques, he knows he needs to get away, save himself, but his legs just will not move. He is rooted to the spot because something inside of him told him he has to save his brother. It doesn't matter if everyone thinks he's a coward. That's his brother. He needs to do something. And so Jacques, he turns to the kids who are running away from him, and he screams at them to stop, come back. And the kids were so surprised to hear this strong, authoritative voice coming out of the wet chicken that they did stop and turned around to see what he wanted. And he said, get over here. I have a plan. And so the kids, with the exception of the redhead who had run off by himself, they came back to Jacques, and Jacques began telling them his plan to save Jean. And the kids, again, were so taken with how Jacques was really owning this moment and being a leader that they all said, okay, let's do this. And so after this very quick planning meeting, all the kids turned and began running up the hillside towards the beast of Gévaudan, with Jacques in the front with his staff out. And the kids gained on the beast really quickly, and the creature clearly noticed and kept turning around and kept looking at these kids getting closer and closer, but the beast did not seem interested in any of them. It just wanted Jean. And in fact, it moved Jean from its arm up into its mouth, and then the creature began kind of using the trees to pull itself faster and faster away from the kids. But Jacques, he just kept going faster and faster and pushing himself to get closer and closer, and as he did, it motivated the other kids to follow along and push it and gain on this creature. And finally, they got close enough to this beast that Jacques yelled out to the kids, "Now!" And they all fanned out around it and began smashing this beast with their staffs they used to shepherd their livestock. Now, none of their blows to this creature were doing any real damage, and the creature did not really seem fazed that the kids were now attacking it, but they were kind of able, with their strikes to this creature, to direct it and get it to kind of turn in the direction that Jacques had told them to make the creature go. And so the kids continued to beat and poke and corral this creature, and every time they'd hit it, the beast would kind of flail out with one of its arms, but it never really did anything because, again, it's really focused, obviously, on taking Jean. But eventually, Jacques' plan worked. He had corralled the creature to the top of the hillside, right over where that bog was, where those rocks in the middle were part of the story that Jacques had told about how there was this portal to another world. And once this creature was positioned where Jacques wanted it, he again yelled to the kids to do the next phase of their plan. And all the kids kind of fanned out to the top of the hill, and with their staffs, they beat and poked this creature down the hill into the bog. And as they did this, Jacques kept looking to see if Jean was alive, because earlier he had been screaming and kicking, but now there was blood all over his brother, and he was limp in the creature's mouth, and he wasn't making any sound. But Jacques didn't care. He wanted to get his brother back, dead or alive. And so finally, Jacques stepped forward from the group, and he wound up and he smashed the beast as hard as he could, hard enough that the beast actually kind of stumbled forward into the actual marshy bog. And what Jacques knew about this bog and why he had come up with that particular story about there being a gateway to another world is weeks earlier, he had actually accidentally stepped into this bog and saw it was really deep. And he had been lucky enough that he had grabbed a rock and kind of pulled himself out, because if he hadn't, the bog kind of functioned like quicksand. You could get stuck in the bog and never get out again. And this is what happened to the beast of Gévaudan. It went feet first into the one spot of the bog that Jacques had had all the kids corral it to, that was the deepest and most dangerous part. And as soon as the beast stepped into it, it sunk down to its waist. And immediately the beast reached out with its huge muscular arms and tried to pull itself out of the bog, but it couldn't. It was stuck. And so in its panic, it let go of Jean from its mouth, and it actually turned around and it looked at Jacques and the other kids. And when it did, Jacques almost lost his nerve, because when he saw this thing face to face up close, he saw this was not a wolf's face. This was almost like a human face. Its eyes were making distinct eye contact with Jacques, and it was furious. It was like the beast understood that Jacques had just trapped it. He had tricked the beast into walking into this bog, and it wanted to kill Jacques. And for a moment, Jacques was totally entranced by this creature's eyes. It just struck him that this looks human. It looks intelligent. What is this thing? And while Jacques was kind of in this daze, the creature reached forward and slashed his stomach wide open, and Jacques fell backwards on the ground, but luckily he was far enough away from the beast that he couldn't be pulled back in. And in this kind of frantic moment, one of the other kids saw an opportunity and ran forward, grabbed Jean, who was laying on the surface of the bog, and he pulled him away from the beast. And the beast whipped around. He tried to grab Jean, but he couldn't. And so all of a sudden, all these kids were safely away from the beast of Gévaudan, who was totally trapped. And so at this point, the other kids who were not hurt, they scooped up Jacques and they scooped up Jean, and they began running away from the bog, across the pasture, back towards the village, leaving the beast where it was. And as they ran, they heard it bellowing out and roaring and trying to pull itself out, but it still just remained in the bog. And finally, as they got back to that dirt path that led back to the village, They saw there was a group of armed villagers running towards them, because it would turn out the redhead who had ran off, he had told the village, and they were coming out to help the kids. And so as the armed villagers met with the kids, they told them where the beast was, stuck in that bog, and the villagers took off to go kill the beast. And then the kids, along with Jacques and Jean, they went into the village. They were put into a home and put on beds, by which point the village doctor had come over and began treating both of them. Jean was alive, but just barely. He had lost a lot of blood, and the beast had grabbed onto his scalp and really crushed his skull, but he would ultimately survive. As for Jacques, it was a very painful wound that he had sustained on his stomach, but none of his internal organs had been damaged, and so he would also survive as well. As for the armed villagers, even though they very quickly got out to that bog where the beast was, when they got there, the beast was gone. And the beast of Gévaudan would continue to kill people for another 2 years, until June 19th, 1767, when a hunter happened to encounter it in the middle of a forest, and he shot and killed it. And by that point, over 100 people had been murdered by this creature. The hunter would drag the carcass of the beast back into his village, and a doctor would perform an autopsy, but the doctor was unable to identify what kind of animal it was. It did kind of look like a wolf, a really huge wolf, but its body was just so misshapen and its bones were too big, and it clearly walked on 2 legs, not on all 4s, and so there was never any definitive information about what this even was and how this even happened. But when they opened up its stomach, they did find human body parts. Jacques was one of the only people to have ever survived an encounter with the beast of Gévaudan. And so he was celebrated all across France, and he quickly went from being the wet chicken to the little hero, and his story would reach as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. And in fact, Jacques' story was so well publicized that it eventually reached King Louis XV, and he was so moved by it that he invited Jacques to come meet him, and after meeting Jacques, he loved him and offered to pay for his entire education. And so Jacques would get to finally leave this little village where he never quite fit in, and he would move to northern France and enroll in a prestigious school there, and he would spend his days reading and writing just like he had always hoped for.
On the afternoon of May 21st, 1974, a 39-year-old man named Pilar Gomez walked through a forest in Argentina. In his hand was a machete and an axe. And as he walked, he used the machete to clear brush, and then eventually he reached this huge tree, and he put the machete down, gripped his axe, and got ready to chop it down. However, before Pilar took his first swing, he looked up and he noticed pretty high up on this tree were these very deep claw marks right into the bark of the tree. Now, at first he thought, oh, that's gotta be, a bear's claw marks. But the more he looked at it, the more he realized that would have been an enormous bear to leave marks like those. I mean, these are deep and wide claw marks. Now, Pilar was a professional lumberjack, and he actually lived in this section of forest. He owned this plot of the forest. His cabin was only a few yards away, and he was used to coming in contact with the wildlife, like bears. Now, his friends and family thought he was crazy for living out here. I mean, his neighbors were miles away. He didn't have a phone or a car. He lived totally alone. And so in virtue of living in this isolated forest, Pilar routinely came across animals that lived out here, like bears. And it didn't really frighten him. He sort of understood that's part of living out here. But he knew his friends and family thought he was totally crazy for living out here. And not just because it was so isolated, not just because he didn't have a car or a phone and was totally alone basically 24/7, but because, according to local legend, this particular forest was effectively haunted. There were these apparent unnatural huge creatures that roamed this forest and would prey on people like Pilar. But Pilar didn't believe in any of that nonsense. He knew that, as he looked at these claw marks, this has to be a bear. This is not some huge unnatural creature that's completely made up. And so Pilar just went ahead and began cutting this tree down. And right as this tree smashed into the ground, making a thundering boom, at the exact same moment, basically right behind Pilar, he heard this horrible growling noise, like a huge animal was basically coming up right behind him. And so Pilar, he whipped around and looked, but there was nothing there. It was just a wide open forest. Everywhere he looked, it was just trees, nothing else. And so Pilar began to think to himself, did I even hear that? I mean, could I really have just been hearing the sound of the tree hitting the ground that somehow also sounded like a growl behind me? Like, Am I, psyching myself out here? Am I creating stories in my head because I'm thinking about those claw marks? And he was like, you know what? It's all going to be in my head. I didn't hear anything. I'm all alone out here. I'm safe. I'm good. And so Pilar just got back to work processing this tree. For the next couple of hours, he didn't see or hear anything strange. He just continued to chop this tree into smaller pieces, and then he would carry those pieces right over to his cabin, which again was not far away, and he stacked up this huge pile of lumber right beside the side of his cabin. And then finally, when the tree was all processed and Pilar was back in his cabin, he realized he was pretty hungry. At this point, it was getting dark outside and it was time for dinner. Typically, Pilar would eat his dinner outside. He enjoyed listening to the crickets and just feeling the warm night air, and tonight was no exception. So he grabbed some stew from the night before, he went outside, and outside he had this table that was right next to his cabin, and then just beyond the table, farther away from the cabin, was this wood stove. And so he got the wood stove going, and then he put his stew on the stove to warm up, and then he sat down at the table, and he just sat there, enjoying the night, waiting for his food to be done. And as Pilar just sat there relaxing, he suddenly realized that he couldn't hear any crickets. They had gone completely silent. And then as he looked around at the dark forest, he realized the forest was actually silent. I mean, there was no noise whatsoever. The only noise was his stove. And Pilar knew that the only time the forest got this way was if there was some big predator around. And so right away, Pilar thought back to the claw marks in the tree and, that growling sound that he wasn't sure if he heard or not. And he's thinking, maybe the bear is back. And so Pilar scanned the tree line, trying to see movement. But there was nothing. It was just deadly silent and just a dark forest in all directions. And so feeling really unsettled, Pilar decided he should just go back inside his cabin and eat in there where it was more safe. And so Pilar stood up and he walked towards his cabin and he was about to go inside when he remembered he had left the stove on with the stew on top warming up. And so he turned back around and he looked out at the dark forest and it's still totally silent. He can't see any movement. And as quick as he could, he walked past the table, out to the stove, he shut the vents in the stove, and he was about to grab the stew to go back inside with it, when something really powerful struck him in the back, knocking the wind out of him, and then before he could react, he looked down and he saw this massive furry arm with sharp claws reaching around him, pulling at his midsection. It was the bear. And so immediately Pilar began thrashing, trying to get away, and he managed to kind of stumble forward, and his machete was on the ground near the stove. And he fumbles down, he grabs the machete, and he wheels around to strike this bear to get rid of it. But the second he saw the bear, he realized it wasn't a bear. And instinctively he knew he just had to run. And so he turned and began sprinting towards that lumber pile he had cut up before right next to his cabin. And as he was scrambling up this pile, he could hear the sound of this thing running towards him. And then he felt another explosion on the side of his head. And even though he now has been wounded, probably gravely, it was like all adrenaline. And he kept going up the lumber pile and he clambered onto the roof of his cabin. Then he turned around, getting ready to fight as best as he could, whatever this thing was. But when he looked out, this thing was just gone. The forest was deadly silent again and there was nothing out there. And so as he's sitting there kind of looking around, waiting for this thing to pop back up again, he reached up and he felt the side of his head and his ear was missing. This thing had ripped his ear off when it hit him in the side of the head. Pilar would remain on the roof of his cabin all night, just constantly scanning, looking for this bear creature to return. But it didn't. The forest just remained totally silent and nothing happened all night. And then finally in the morning when the sun began to come up, the forest kind of went back to normal. And at that point, Pilar is kind of delirious from blood loss and the impact to his head. And he knew he just had to get out of here and go get help. And so he climbed off the roof and then he ran about a mile to the nearest building, which was this woodworking shop. And when he got there, there were a couple of people there. And when they saw the state Pilar was in, they didn't need to be told that he needed to go to the hospital. They just instinctively put him in the car and drove him there. After Pilar was stabilized and his wound was treated and he was sort of in recovery at the hospital, the police showed up to interview him to see what happened. And Pilar would tell them the story about how, the day before he had seen those claw marks in the tree and then he had heard that loud growling sound behind him, or so he thought. And then that night, this bear had attacked him at his cabin. And he said at some point he had broken away and grabbed the machete and he turned to defend himself and he got a good look at this bear. And it was at least 6 feet tall, it was covered in black hair, had sharp claws. I mean, it was every bit a bear, except its face. It wasn't a bear's face. It was a human face. Now, to this point, as Pilar was telling his story, one of the police officers was taking notes. Everything Pilar said, he was writing it down. But when Pilar began talking about the bear with the human face, the officer just stopped taking notes, and the officer said, that can't be true. There aren't any bears with human faces. But Pilar, he's like a rugged lumberjack who lives in the forest by himself. And he's telling these officers, I know how crazy this sounds. I know it's not realistic, but I'm telling you what I saw is this bear with a human face. That's what I saw. But the officer just 100% did not believe him. And ultimately, this went down as simply a bear attack, and that was it. The case was closed. However, despite what the police said, since the attack on Pilar, there have been at least 30 people who have come forward to say they either saw firsthand or were attacked by this bear-like creature with a human face in that forest in Argentina. Sightings are so common that locals even came up with a name for this creature. They call it the Ucumar. And to this day, nobody has any idea who or what it is.
On February 24th, 1983, a 21-year-old man named Don Decker walked into a funeral home in the tiny rural town of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where Don's grandfather's funeral was being held. And as soon as Don walked inside, he saw his grandfather's casket open for viewing at the front of the room, and then he also saw lots of his family members and friends of his grandfather kind of kneeled around the casket and, sitting in the front seats of this funeral home, and everybody is quietly crying and kind of consoling each other. But Don, he walks in and he doesn't talk to anybody in his family, doesn't talk to any of the friends, he doesn't go up to his grandfather's casket. Instead, Don sat down in the very last row of seats, he folded his arms, and just scowled angrily as he looked around the room. Unlike everybody else inside of this funeral home, Don was not remotely sad. He was instead just totally angry. In fact, as he was sitting there, he was clenching his fists so hard out of fury that his fingernails were practically cutting into his skin. Don had come to this funeral home directly from the Monroe County Correctional Facility, where he was serving a 4 to 12 month sentence for receiving stolen property. The jail had granted Don a furlough, which is a temporary leave of absence, so he could go to his grandfather's funeral. And Don had jumped at the opportunity, mostly just to get out of jail for a minute, but now that he was actually at the funeral, he kind of regretted going. Eventually, the actual funeral began, and one by one, Don's family members would go up to the podium and say something nice about the grandfather, and then sit back down. And at first, Don, he put up with it, but after a couple people had spoken, Don was just livid. He just couldn't hear any more. And so he tried to focus his attention just on his grandfather's casket, where he could literally see his grandfather's face as he was laying there. And as he was staring at his grandfather's face, suddenly Don saw something and he stood up really suddenly in his seat. And in fact, when he stood up, it immediately caught the attention of the speaker, which was Don's cousin, and the cousin just stopped and stared at Don. And at that point, the rest of the people in the funeral also turned around and looked at Don. And Don, he knew people were looking at him, but he didn't care anymore. He was now so focused on his grandfather because a second ago, he could have sworn he saw his grandfather's lips moving like he was still alive. But as Don continued to stare at his grandfather, expecting his lips to move again, they didn't. And so finally, Don didn't say a word to all these people who were still staring at him, and he just turned and stalked out of the funeral home. Once Don was outside, he thought for a second about heading to the home where he knew his whole family would be going after the funeral, but Don just could not face being around that crowd again, and so instead, he headed to his friend's home. It was this couple named Bob and Jeannie Kiefer, and the reason Don wanted to see them is he knew they were just kind of laid-back people who would not ask him a lot of questions, and they would just kind of let him have some peace and quiet. And really all Don wanted between now and 2 days from now, when he had to go back to jail when his furlough ended, was just to have some peace and quiet. And so Don made his way to their house, and when he got there, Bob and Jeannie were so excited to see him. They called him inside and said, hey, we're going to make dinner, go wash up and relax, and we'll eat together. Don didn't say much, but, he nodded a thank you, he went inside, and right away he went upstairs to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on his face because still, Don just could not shake that anger he was feeling when he was inside the funeral home. And for a second, the splashing of water on his face seemed to be working. He felt like his whole body was getting cooler. In fact, the whole bathroom seemed to have this coolness descend on it. But a weird thing started to happen. Don, as he's feeling this kind of cool come over him, he realized it was actually getting so cold in the bathroom, literally, like physically cold in the bathroom, that it was becoming uncomfortable, like he was cold. And then when Don just happened to look up at the mirror right in front of him, he could have sworn for a second he saw on the edge of the mirror the face of an old man wearing a gold crown. And immediately Don, he kind of freaked out and turned around, but there was nothing there. And as he's like shivering from the cold from being in this bathroom, he began looking all around him, trying to find this old man with a crown on his head, but obviously there was nothing in the bathroom with him. And so Don felt totally unsettled by this. He didn't understand why it was so cold. He didn't know what he had just seen. And then Don happened to look down at his wrists, and he saw there were these deep scratches all over both of his wrists. And so kind of in a panic, Don just rolled his sleeves down to cover up whatever was on his wrists. He didn't want to think about it. He turned off the water and sprinted out of that freezing cold bathroom and just made his way downstairs where Bob and Jeannie were just sitting down for dinner. So Don, he took his seat, he got his food, and he didn't tell Bob or Jeannie about anything that had just happened up in the bathroom. He just sat there and ate in silence. Now, Bob and Jeannie could clearly tell something was on Don's mind, but they'd known him for years, and they knew he was just not the type to come out and talk about anything personal. He basically completely kept to himself, and then when he spoke, he was kind of oddly flat and monotone and emotionless. That was just who he was. But, he didn't cause any problems. He was a very nice guy. And so for this entire meal, Bob and Jeannie just kind of looked at Don, but didn't ask him any questions and just let him eat in peace. After the trio was done eating, Jeannie gathered up their dishes and headed to the kitchen to wash up, and Bob and Don headed to the living room where they sat down and Bob turned on the TV, and for a few minutes the two friends just watched TV. But at some point, Bob realized when he looked over at Don that Don was not really looking at the TV. He was actually looking down at the ground. It was like he was just sitting there motionless, just staring off into space. And Bob thought to himself, wow, Don must be catatonic with grief here from losing his grandfather. But Bob, he felt really bad for Don, but he had no idea what to say to him. He knew Don was not about to launch into some deep story about how he was feeling. And so Bob just sat there and said nothing, hoping that, just his physical presence next to Don was comforting in some way to Don during this really difficult time. And so a few minutes goes by, and the two men are still silently sitting in their seats when Bob begins to hear what sounds like running water. And at first, he looked over at Don, thinking maybe Don had spilled a drink on the ground, but Don didn't have a drink. Don was still just sitting there catatonic, staring at the ground in front of him. And then, Bobby turned and looked towards the kitchen, thinking maybe Jeannie had spilled a drink, but she didn't appear to have done that. And then Bob felt a drop of water land on his head. And so he looked up and he saw water was coming through the ceiling. And so right away, Bob stood up and he yelled to his wife that a pipe had burst. And then Bob, he grabbed his phone and he called his landlord, who lived right nearby, and said, you got to get over here. There's a pipe that's burst in your house. And just a couple of minutes later, the landlord and his wife arrived at the house. The landlord ran inside and he and Bob rushed upstairs to try to find the origin of this leak. And when they got up there, they looked everywhere and there was no obvious sign of where water could be leaking from. The toilet wasn't overflowing, neither was the sink. They couldn't hear the sound of running water anywhere. And then they also realized as they're walking around upstairs that where the leak was coming through the ceiling above the living room, they went to that rough area above the living room, and the landlord was like, there's no plumbing over this area. There should be absolutely no water anywhere near where the water was coming through. And so Bob and the landlord were very confused, and they began walking downstairs to try to figure out what else they could do. And when they walked downstairs, two things happened very quickly. The first was, as they came down the stairs, they were entering the living room where the leak had originally been noticed. And when they walked back into the living room, they saw right away that this leak had grown, and it was now not just coming out of the ceiling of the living room, but it was also now leaking out of the walls of the living room. Basically, all the different walls and surfaces in the living room were leaking water. And then the second thing they noticed was Dawn. Dawn was still sitting on the couch, still just totally catatonic, staring at the ground, not doing anything, which made no sense. Everybody else in the house is running around trying to figure out this leak, and there's Dawn just staring at the ground. And so Bob, who at this point is pretty overwhelmed with what's happening here, but he thought, I gotta make sure Dawn's okay. And so he just walked through the leaking living room right over to Dawn, and he said, Dawn, are you okay? And Don, he didn't say anything, he didn't move, but his mouth kind of contorted into this weird smile with his lips kind of pulling away from his teeth, and all the tendons on the top of his hands began to tense as he wiggled his fingers. And Bob, at this point, he realized there's something wrong with Don, and they needed to call the police. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I got out of the military in 2017, it was one of the most difficult times in my life. Now, on paper, I was sort of like the best version of myself. I had just retired from the Navy SEAL teams, something I was very proud of, and I had this beautiful young family. But transitioning back into the civilian world was terrible for me. I was depressed, I was unemployed, and I was too ashamed to tell anyone, and so day by day, it was like I just spiraled and got worse and worse and worse. But luckily, my family noticed how badly I was doing, and they gently encouraged me to seek out professional help, to go see a therapist. And I did. I can honestly say I think that saved my life. I was going down a very dark path when I did finally reach out and get help. And so now I can honestly say I am the best version of myself today, and that's largely because of therapy. Now, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're struggling right now, therapy is a really good starting point. And a very accessible therapy option is BetterHelp. They're on a mission to make starting therapy easier, which is why they're entirely online. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched up with a BetterHelp therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if you don't click with your therapist, it's no issue. You can easily swap for another one at no additional cost. If you're struggling and you think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story. Two police officers named John Bojan and Richard Wolbert arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house. And so they came inside, and Bob quickly tried to explain what was going on. But John and Richard, they walked inside and immediately saw, okay, something totally weird is happening here. Because they looked into the living room and they saw water coming down from the ceiling, coming out of the walls. It was even bubbling up all over the floor. And in the middle of all this chaos was one person, Don, who's just sitting there totally erect, not moving, wiggling his fingers with this weird expression on his face. And the police very quickly said to Bob that we don't know what this is. We don't even know how to help. So we're going to get our police chief. And as soon as those officers left, it was like Bob, Jeannie, the landlord's wife, they were now scared to be in this house. Before, it was just baffling. But now, with Don sitting there tapping his fingers with that weird grimace on his face and water coming out of everywhere for no reason, it was like terrifying. And so the four of them just kind of huddled in the dining room staring at Don and the living room until finally the two officers came back with their police chief. But once the chief came inside, things did not get any better because the chief walked inside and he saw how totally weird this was. But his reaction was, this is not a police problem. You clearly have some sort of totally weird plumbing issue that seems very extensive, and your friend, he seems okay, he's just acting really weird. And so the chief told his two officers, John and Richard, to not talk about what they saw in this house and just leave, don't report it, get out of here, we're done with this. And just like that, John, Richard, the police chief, they said, okay guys, your problem, and they left. And then Bob and Jeannie's landlord was like, okay, we're gonna get a plumber over here right away, and you can deal with this. And then they left. And so Bob and Jeannie at this point are totally unsettled, and they just stood in the dining room staring over at the living room where Don was just sitting there tapping his fingers, water's leaking all around him. And then finally a plumber came to the house and they searched the whole house and they could not find anywhere where there was a leak. It literally didn't make sense that the living room was still leaking water. And so Bob, he contacted his landlord and said, what do you want me to do? And the landlord said, you know what? I don't know. We'll send out more plumbers tomorrow. We'll figure it out. And so Bob and Jeannie, they just put out as many towels and blankets as they could all over the living room, doing their best to kind of sop up the water. The whole time they're glancing over at Don, who's still not moving, tapping his fingers, sitting on the couch. And then finally, after Bob and Jeannie had exhausted their towel and blanket supply trying to sop up all this water, they're like, what can we even do? It's still leaking. We can't stop it. We don't know what's going on with Don. And so the couple just sat in the dining room staring into the living room, basically at Don, just kind of waiting for him to maybe break out of his trance. And eventually Don would, break out of his trance, kind of. Instead of, suddenly standing up and talking to Bob and Jeannie, he just eventually kind of dozed off, still in the upright sitting position. And so at this point, Bob walked over to Don just to check on him and make sure he was breathing and that he was okay. And so he checked, and he was, Don was okay. But Bob noticed that on Don's neck were all these dark red scratches and marks, like someone had been strangling him. And then also on the inside of Don's collar was a little bit of blood. And so Bob, he calls over Jeannie and he's like, "What do you make of this?" And she's like, "I don't know. This whole thing, I don't know what's going on here." And so the couple decided they would just go to bed. Don seems like he's okay. He's sleeping on the couch. We can't fix the water, so that's all we can do. And so the couple, they went upstairs, they went to bed, and the next morning when they came back down, the living room was still leaking, and Don was wide awake again, back in that sitting position, tapping his fingers with this bizarre grimace on his face. And all day that day, and all day the next day, that's where Don would stay, in that position, only stopping to fall asleep, still in that position. And over those 2 days, all these plumbers and different people came over the house, and nobody could figure out where this leak was coming from. And so the water just continued to pool inside of the living room. And then finally, on February 26th, so 2 days after Don had arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house, Don suddenly stood up. He didn't say a word to Bob or Jeannie. He just walked out of the house. And as soon as he did, all the water that was leaking out of the ceiling and the walls stopped. Don would go back to prison, and when he walked into his cell, his cellmate took one look at Don, and apparently the look on Don's face was so unsettling that the cellmate immediately called over one of the guards and said, "You got to get me out of the cell. I can't be in here with this guy." And so this cellmate and the guard, they both turned and looked at Don, and Don, he was at the back of the cell and he was facing both of them. And when they looked at Don, that totally weird grimace came across his face, the same one he had on as he sat in Bob and Jeannie's house for those 2 days. It was the same expression, and with that expression on his face, in this totally creepy kind of hollow voice, he says to the two men, "I can make it rain." Now, the cellmate was terrified of Don and was practically screaming for the guard to let him leave the cell, but the guard, who was definitely unsettled by Don and his behavior, he was less scared and more just kind of intrigued with what Don had just said. And he said, "Okay, hey Don, if you can make it rain, then why don't you make it rain in the warden's office?" And after the guard said this, Don's expression, that kind of creepy, weird smile he had, it grew larger and larger until he had this totally bizarre smile on his face, exposing all of his teeth. At this point, the guard now felt totally terrified of Don and understood why the cellmate was so scared of him. And kind of instinctively, the guard just turned and ran into the warden's office to tell the warden what was going on with this guy. But when he got into the warden's office, he looked at the warden, Dave Keenhold was his name, and he was sitting at his desk doing some paperwork, and Dave looked up at the guard, and the guard realized on Dave's chest, his shirt, there was this wet spot that was growing slowly all over his chest, and it was almost like the warden didn't realize it was happening. And so Dave looks up at the guard and he's like, "What's going on?" And the guard, he just points at Dave's chest and says, "Look!" And so the guard told the warden about what he had just witnessed in the jail cell and how he had kind of jokingly told Don to make it rain in the warden's office, and now there's this wet patch on your shirt, what's going on here? And the warden, he looked down and he was just as caught off guard by this wet spot on his shirt. And so he leapt up and he and the guard ran back to Don's jail cell. And when they got there, they couldn't believe what they saw. Water was pouring out of the ceiling. It was coming out of the ground. Even the bars were leaking water. And there was Don in the back of the cell, standing there with that terrible smile on his face, and his fingers were contorting. All the tendons were all tight in his hand. And his cellmate was practically crying, huddled in the corner. And so right away, Warden Keenhold moved the cellmate out of that cell, put him in another cell, and then shut the cell where Don was. And then the warden called a plumber to come out here and stop this leak from wherever it was coming from. But the plumber came to the jail, and no matter where he looked, he could not find anything that would cause this leak inside of this jail cell. It just didn't make sense. And in fact, the plumber was so scared of Don, who the whole time this inspection is happening, he's standing in the back, wiggling his fingers with this bizarre look on his face. The plumber was so scared of Don that after he told the warden that he couldn't find a leak, he just left without even being paid. He just had to get away from Don. Now, Warden Keenhold had no idea what was happening with Don, but he could tell it was well beyond his own expertise, and frankly, he had no idea who he should call about what was going on. And so he just called the jail's minister and asked him to come over and see what was going on. But when the Reverend got there and saw Don and saw all the water in the cell, he too had no idea what to do. But when the Reverend walked up to the bars to get a closer look at Don began to move in the cell as well towards the Reverend. And Don, he would stop about halfway through the cell, and when he did, the Reverend stopped as well. And they were kind of looking at each other, and then Don, he raised up his right arm into the air. And when he did, more and more water began pouring into the cell, and also this terrible rotting smell filled the entire jail. It smelled like death. And the Reverend, he was horrified by it, and Don, he was just grinning with his arm up, and then he brought his arm down and began rubbing his hands together and just staring at the Reverend. At this point, the Reverend grabbed his Bible and began reading passages accusing Don of being possessed by Satan, and he was reading all these passages from the Bible to try to banish this evil spirit from Don. And then suddenly Don just let out this horrible guttural scream that was so loud, the Reverend had to stop and cover his ears, and so did the warden and the guard and the cellmate. And then after he let out this horrible scream, it was like Don snapped back to reality and he just collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. It would take Don a long time to finally open up about what the heck had just happened to him, but he would eventually open up to his friends Bob and Jeannie. And while his explanation for what he went through did explain some aspects of what occurred between February 24th and 26th of 1983, it did not explain everything. Don and his grandfather had been very close. However, when Don was just 7 years old, his grandfather began abusing him physically. Don had kept the violence a secret for his entire life, but he had come to view his grandfather as the human embodiment of evil. And so when his grandfather passed away, Don frankly was relieved to find out his grandfather was dead. But when he went to the funeral and he saw all of his loved ones talking about his grandfather as being this incredible person, so loving, so kind, it totally infuriated Don. And as he felt this anger growing inside of him, Don could have sworn he saw his dead grandfather's lips move. And at the time, Don had no idea what to make of it, but he would later say that he believes that was the moment that his evil grandfather's spirit basically possessed him. And Don would say when he got to Bob and Jeannie's house, he began to feel like there was something wrong with him, but he couldn't stop whatever it was. It was like there was somebody else in his brain making him do and say things that he didn't want to do, but he just couldn't stop it. And so he had gone upstairs to the bathroom in Bob and Jeannie's house, hoping to splash some water on his face and make himself feel better. And that was when he saw that old man's face. Well, that face was his grandfather's face. He was wearing that crown. And Don would say he thinks the reason he was wearing a crown is because it signified he had all the power over Don. And then also Don had those scratches on his wrists, which he thought was his grandfather as well. He went downstairs and tried to tell himself that everything was okay. But after Don sat down on the couch, he said he couldn't move anymore. It was like his grandfather had totally took over, and he locked him on the couch with that bizarre contorted expression, and he kept moving Don's hands around. And then obviously the water began leaking in the room for no reason, which Don says was entirely his grandfather. He was just trying to scare all of Don's friends and Don himself. It was his way of tormenting Don a little bit more. And then again at the jail, when the same scene kind of unfolded, Don believed it was his evil grandfather inflicting just a little bit more pain and torment. For almost a decade after this happened, everybody involved in this didn't really talk about it publicly, especially the police and the jailers. They did not talk about what they witnessed because they were worried talking about it publicly would make them look like crazy people and they'd get fired. But eventually in the 90s, 9 people, including 4 police officers and the jail warden, would officially go on the record and testify to what they saw happening. And it would include Don seeming totally deranged and in a trance-like state as water just poured into these rooms that he was in. To this day, we do not have an explanation for what happened to Don. The only explanation that seems to make sense is that Don really was possessed by his evil grandfather. Also, it should be noted that Don never made it rain again. The only times that happened were in Bob and Jeannie's house and in that jail cell from February 24th to February 26th, 1983. After that, Don lived a totally normal life.
At 6:30 p.m. on July 29, 2023, a 15-year-old girl named Talia Davila Diaz stood right outside her back door of her house, staring out at the thick, dense, shadowy rainforest that was her backyard. Talia lived in a tiny, isolated village in Peru that was literally in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So as she was looking out, she would have seen these huge tropical trees and heard the sound of howler monkeys and exotic birds and animals moving all about, and the air would have been really thick and humid. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. Instead, she was focused on this grapefruit tree that was only a few yards away from her house. She wanted to go get a grapefruit and bring it inside and make juice for her family. However, Talia was scared. And she was scared for two reasons. The first reason was this was the Amazon, an inherently dangerous place, especially at night. There were loads of predators out there, like snakes and jaguars. But the other reason she was scared was that she was worried there could actually be something worse out in the rainforest, worse than any predators she was used to. And that was because over the last couple of weeks, people in Talia's village had been claiming they were seeing these shadowy figures lurking in the tree line with these bright green eyes that would occasionally seem like they were hunting the people of the village. Like anytime they went out, it was like these figures were kind of lurking off in the distance, but nobody knew what they were. The rumor around the village was that these shadowy figures were actually pelikaras, which translates literally to face peelers. People in Talia's village believed that pelikaras were foreigners who would kidnap locals and cut their throats and peel the skin of their face off and then sell their body fat on the black market. And the locals were so freaked out that pelikaras could be around that they began performing nightly patrols to keep the villagers safe. So Talia, again, was very scared to even leave her house at this point. But she was also trying to be reasonable. She'd gone out and gotten a grapefruit many times in the past. This was not some new behavior, so she's looking out and she sees the grapefruit tree and she knows there's a nightly patrol out right now, and I only have to go a few yards and get the fruit and get right back in the house. Like, how big of a deal could this possibly be? And so after taking one more look around and not seeing anybody or hearing anything that was out of place, she took a breath and then rushed out to the tree. She grabbed a grapefruit, and as she was turning around, she froze because her worst nightmare had just been realized. Now, standing between her and her back door were these two hulking dark figures. And one of them was like so tall, it was practically the size of a tree. And they both had these piercing, glowing green eyes. And they were looking right at Talia. And Talia was so instantaneously petrified that all she could do was just stand there and stare back into their green eyes. And as she did, she began to notice that their faces were grotesquely elongated, almost like they had masks on. And then before Talia could do anything, the really tall one began sort of gliding towards her. Not stepping towards her, but literally almost hovering off the ground towards Talia. And then suddenly, Talia was being grabbed and thrown to the ground. And the instant Talia hit the ground, these two figures descended on her and pinned her there. And then one of them reached down and pressed their hand over her mouth and her nose, and she couldn't breathe. And then she sees the other one is holding what looked like a box cutter or a knife, and they put it right up to her neck. And suddenly it's like Talia understands these are pelikaras. They're gonna slit her throat. They're gonna kill her. And so she has this sudden burst of energy and she manages to push them off of her. And when she did, their hand came off her mouth and she screamed out for help. And she heard somewhere in the village voices yelling back to her, and then she heard footsteps, and she knew it was the night patrol coming to save her. And so at this point, the figures released Talia, and she scrambled to her feet and immediately ran towards her house right as the night patrol came bounding into her yard, and one of the men had a gun, and he raised it and began shooting in the direction of the figures. And Talia, she's totally panicked, and she turns around, and she looks at her attackers, and she's expecting them to, be fleeing into the rainforest. But instead, these dark figures, they were like levitating in the sky, and they were looking down at Talia and the night patrol with their glowing green eyes as they literally began to levitate into the sky. And the whole time, the night patrol is firing repeatedly at these things, and they just drifted off into the night and disappeared. Talia ultimately would not suffer any physical injuries from this encounter, but mentally, she was a wreck. And frankly, so was the rest of the people in her village, especially those who were on the night patrol and with Talia witnessed these figures with green eyes flying away into the sky. The fear in this village following this encounter was through the roof. And in fact, ultimately, the Peruvian government would get involved after this encounter, and they would investigate to try to figure out, what happened to Talia. And they would ultimately conclude that there was an illegal mining operation happening somewhere in the rainforest, and some of these miners, in an effort to scare people away from coming anywhere near their operation, they got their hands on jetpacks, wore armor and masks, and then went into villages like Talia's and basically pretended to be aliens and then did, fly off on their jetpacks. That is the official story as of right now. However, people like Talia and the other people in her village and many other people who live in the Amazon rainforest who have come in contact with these figures with green eyes, they say those are no miners. Those are either Palacaras or they are creatures from another world. On February 27th, 2025, a man in his 30s named John grabbed a drink out of his fridge in his kitchen and then walked into his living room. He had just finished work, and his wife and kids were out visiting his in-laws, and so tonight he was excited to just sit on the couch and watch TV. As he sat down, he called out to his dog. There was a huge thunderstorm outside, and he knew his dog was deathly afraid of thunder, and so he expected her to come running as soon as she heard her name. But after he called her, he heard nothing. But this didn't worry him, because he figured, his dog must have found a good hiding spot and had just fallen asleep there. So John turned his attention to the TV and began looking for a horror movie to watch. But as he did, he started thinking about his wife and his kids driving home that night, and he was worried about them, because of the weather. So instead of clicking on a horror movie, he turned to the local news to check on the weather. However, as soon as the local news came on, it was not the weather they were talking about, despite this being a major storm. This should have kind of dominated the news, but it wasn't. Instead, there was a much bigger story on the news right now, and that was there was this huge riot happening at a state prison that was only 10 miles away from where John lived. And apparently, the most dangerous convict at this prison had escaped. The newscasters began to describe this convict, and they said he actually had a nickname the other prisoners had given him. They called him the Monster of Cell Block C. Now, this nickname had to do in part with the fact that he was just a horrible criminal, like people were scared of him. And then also, the nickname came from his just totally bizarre and threatening behavior. He would routinely sit in the corner of his cell and eat insects off the ground. And then also, he kept jumping on prison guards every chance he got, which got him thrown in solitary confinement, where he just continued to eat the insects there and act totally unhinged. But perhaps the biggest reason he was dubbed the Monster of Cell Block C is because of his appearance. He had these crazy bulging eyes and this really thick neck. It made him look totally deformed. The anchors were telling locals to stay vigilant because the police had no idea where the Monster of Cell Block C was. Maybe he was still at the prison, but it did seem entirely possible that he really had escaped. And then it seemed like the anchors were about to put a picture up of the actual inmate himself, when suddenly John heard this huge boom of thunder outside, and then the power in his house just completely cut out, so the TV shut off. He didn't get to see what the inmate looked like. John instinctively reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to use the flashlight feature, but his phone was dead. It had died like a couple minutes earlier, and he had told himself, I gotta plug this phone in, but he just hadn't done it yet, and now the power's out. So he has no light source. And on top of that, John couldn't help but feel sort of rattled. He had just heard on the news that, the Monster of Cell Block C has escaped 10 miles away, and now the power's out at his house in the middle of a storm, and he's all alone. But at the same time, John told himself, everything's fine. It's just a coincidence here that the power's gone out right at this moment. I'm fine. The state prison, it's 10 miles away. And why would this convict have any interest coming to my house? So I'm fine. And so John stood up and began heading towards his kitchen where he knew he kept a flashlight. But as he got close to the kitchen, he heard a strange sound. It was an electronic ding, like a phone notification sound. But at the same time, John really couldn't quite place it. And he also knew it couldn't be his phone because his phone was dead. However, he thought maybe it's my kids' iPads. After all, the sound he was hearing, the more he listened, he could tell it was coming from upstairs, and that's where his kids' iPads were. However, the sound still seemed really weird to John because it started suddenly, basically right after the power went out. He hadn't heard it before that. And also, if these were, notification sounds on his kids' iPads, you would think there would only be maybe 1 or 2 notifications. You wouldn't have, a string of notification sounds. But as John listened, he heard like this incessant amount of dinging coming from the upstairs. And it wasn't constant, it was sort of sporadic, like random dings kind of all over the place. But then John remembered that his kids' iPads had a messaging app on it so they could talk to their parents. And John remembered that, his phone is dead, his wife could be out there driving in the storm, and so maybe she was trying to get in touch with him, couldn't because his phone was dead, and so now she was trying to message him using their kids' iPads. And so suddenly his heart rate began to pick up, he ran into the kitchen, he grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and he ran to the base of the stairs that led up to the second floor. And as he began ascending the stairs, he's hearing that dinging sound over and over and over again. He knows it's from somewhere upstairs, and he can't help but feel totally anxious about it, like he can't place it. It kind of sounds like an iPad, but at the same time, it doesn't. He doesn't really know what it is. And so up the stairs he goes, he's scanning all around. There's no movement in the house. He still hasn't seen his dog. He gets to the top of the stairs, and in their house, there was this hallway that ran right and left from the top of the stairs. John looked to the right and shined his flashlight down there, and it was just all darkness and totally silent. The dinging was coming from the left side of the hallway. John swung the flashlight around and he shined it, and as soon as he looked down the hallway to the left side, his heart really began to race. Because remember, the power is off inside of his house, so all the lights and everything should be off. But as he was looking down the hallway, he saw there was bright light coming out from underneath his closed bedroom door. And also, that dinging sound was coming from in his bedroom. And his kids' iPads were not in there. At this point, John was terrified, but he knew he had to go in there. He had to see what was going on inside of his house. And so, very nervously, he began walking down the hallway towards the closed door. And as he's walking, the dinging sound is getting louder and louder. And with each ding from inside of his room, that light that was on inside of there would sort of pulsate. And you could see the light pulsating from underneath the door. And so John is getting more and more nervous as he's getting closer and closer to this door. And then right as he's about to touch the door and actually go inside, he hears a new sound. And it's coming from behind him. In fact, it's coming from downstairs. It was like this thumping sound, like something thick and meaty was like hitting the wooden floors over and over again. John's first thought was, maybe he left a window open downstairs and that was just the sound of the rain coming in. But as he's listening to this thumping sound that's getting louder and closer to him, making its way towards the stairs, he's thinking, that can't possibly be the rain. That does not make any sense. So he thought, oh, it's gotta be my dog. And so he called out to his dog again, this time much more urgently. Frankly, he wanted the comfort at this point, but the dog didn't come, and that thumping sound continued, and it began to go up the stairs. At this point, John knew he needs to go over and see who is now coming up the stairs. He has to go look. But he's paralyzed with fear. He's in the middle of this huge storm, the power's out, he has no idea what's going on with his wife and his kids, there's this escaped convict down the road, he has all these strange noises in his house, and so he just stands there completely unsure what to do. And then finally, as this thumping sound is right about to crest the stairs and be in the hallway, whatever or whoever it was, John turned and just threw open his door, figuring, you know what, at least if I go in my bedroom, I can shut the door and create space between me and whoever this is. But the second he charged into his bedroom, holding the flashlight over his head like a baseball bat, to confront whatever was in there, he just froze, because what he saw in front of him was horrifying. To understand what John saw and why it was so bad, you have to know that overall, John was a pretty nice guy. He was a good father, a good husband, he gave to charity, he took in stray animals. He was the kind of guy who would, if you drop money out on the street, he'd pick it up and give it back to you. He's a good guy. But there was one aspect of his life where John wasn't so nice. In fact, you could make the case that he was sort of a monster himself. John, in one very specific way, was sort of a bully. Every day for the last 5 years, John had been personally bullying and torturing this one victim online, and then also riling up other people to do the same thing. And so on this night, when he flew into his bedroom to escape whatever else was going on in his house, what he saw in his bedroom that was so awful was his victim. And he knew for sure that his victim was here for revenge. John's victim turned attacker was standing right there in the middle of his bedroom, clutching John's dog in their fist, like they were about to squeeze the life out of her. And at the same time, the loud thumping sound that John had run away from into this room that was coming up the stairs, well, John heard it thump against the door to the bedroom. And so John realized that must be another attacker. There's two of them, and now I'm gonna die. And so instinctively, John whipped around and just stared at this door, getting ready for whoever this was to enter the room. And as the door began to swing open, John closed his eyes and put his hands up around his head, bracing for impact. And he's standing there literally waiting to die, but nothing happens. And after a few seconds, John, he opens his eyes and he looks around and he smiles. It would turn out the monster of Cell Block C really had escaped from that state prison during that riot. And after they got out, they went to John's house. But the monster of Cell Block C was not a dangerous, horrible criminal, at least not to John. In fact, the monster of Cell Block C was one of John's oldest friends, and he had broken out of prison for one reason: to save John and his dog. Immediately after entering the bedroom, the monster of Cell Block C leapt onto the attacker who was holding John's dog hostage and managed to free the dog. The dog ran to safety, and then the monster of Cell Block C basically wrestled the attacker onto the ground and restrained them. And as they did this, John, who's sort of standing off to the side, is so relieved, but also he was suddenly inspired. And he had this idea that not only would defeat his attacker for good, but also would keep his friend, the monster of Cell Block C, from going back to prison. John turned and ran out of the bedroom and went into one of his kids' rooms where he grabbed a frog stuffed animal. He ripped the head off, and then he went back into his own bedroom and superglued the frog head onto the top of his attacker. John's attacker, the one he had bullied for so many years, who had come back for revenge, who was in his bedroom emitting pulsing lights and making dinging sounds and grabbed John's dog by their fist and held them hostage, was none other than the like button. John was actually John Allen, aka me, Mr. Ballen. And with that frog head superglued on top of the like button, now they looked a whole lot like the monster of Cell Block C, which of course was my best friend, Seagull Lung. And so when the police showed up a short time later, they carted away the like button because they looked like the monster of Cell Block C. To this day, the like button is still serving out old Lungy's prison sentence. And as for old Seagull Lung, he's somewhere on a beach in Mexico. And now that this story is over, I can finally say, April Fools. On the evening of December 24th, 2001, a 48-year-old businessman named Kevin Butler was in his kitchen inside of his home in Dallas, Texas, preparing food. The following day, he was going to bring this food to a Christmas party at his friend's house. And as Kevin was preparing this food, he heard his friend Larry, who spent a lot of time at his house, call to him from down the hall. Now, Kevin didn't really hear what Larry wanted, but he could tell from the tone of his voice that, he wanted him to come over there right now. And so Kevin said, okay, I'll be there in a second. But then, after washing off his hands and beginning to walk down the hall to go see Larry, Kevin heard another sound that stopped him in his tracks. He heard the sound of two men's voices coming from outside of his house. The men sounded drunk, and they sounded like they were literally in his front yard. And also, Kevin thought he recognized the voices. And so instinctively, Kevin flew over to the door and whipped it open. And sure enough, it was Johnny Serna, one of Kevin's former employees, and Daniel Torres, who was Johnny's half-brother. These were the two men he thought he heard outside, and here they are. And even though Kevin was expecting to see them when he opened the door, it was like seeing them in real life was just totally incendiary. Kevin was immediately so mad. For several months, Kevin and Johnny had been in this very public feud over money. And in fact, Johnny at one point had even tried to steal from Kevin by forging a check. And so now Kevin looked right at Johnny and Daniel and goes, "Oh, what are you guys here to steal from me again?" And in response, Johnny didn't say anything. He just charged forward and punched Kevin square in the face. Kevin was so stunned that he practically fell over. And then before he could do anything, Johnny and Daniel had pummeled him to the ground and were kicking and punching him. And then they dragged him further into his house and slammed the door behind him. Kevin continued to try to get away, but he just couldn't. One of the brothers was holding him down. And then before long, one of the others had gone off and come back with electrical cord, and they tied him up. And then once Kevin literally was fully bound and couldn't go anywhere, the brothers went into the kitchen, got knives, came back, and they began stabbing Kevin over and over and over again. And as all this commotion was happening out in the living room, Kevin's friend Larry, who was right down the hall, heard the whole thing. He heard the sound of, the two drunk guys coming in. He heard the sound of Kevin clearly being attacked. And at first, Larry was terrified and didn't know what to do. But as he heard the sound of Kevin screaming out for help, Larry jumped into action, and he flew down the hallway and he charged out there, and he saw Daniel still on top of Kevin stabbing him, and Larry just went right after Daniel. Now, Larry was unarmed and really didn't stand much of a chance to begin with, but he did whatever he could to try to get Daniel off. He began biting and scratching him and doing whatever he could, but it wasn't enough. And eventually, Daniel overpowered Larry, and then before long, Johnny and Daniel were not just stabbing Kevin, but were also stabbing Larry. And so in the end, both Kevin and Larry, the two friends, were stabbed to death. And then after they were dead, Johnny and Daniel fled the scene. But what the two half-brothers didn't know was that even though they had just killed Larry, Larry had actually just made sure those two brothers would get caught. Because when Larry tried to fight Daniel off, he had literally bit Daniel and gotten Daniel's blood on his mouth. And ultimately, when the police showed up, they took the blood from Larry's mouth, and that was DNA evidence, and it led them right to Daniel. And so Daniel and Johnny were soon arrested and charged with murder. However, they were only charged with one murder. And that's because during the attack, when Larry flew down the hall to try to protect Kevin, well, he literally flew. Because Larry was not a person. Larry was Kevin's pet cockatoo, and he was named after Larry Bird. Kevin had adopted Larry 2 years earlier, and the two had become like best friends. And so when Larry heard his best friend Kevin being attacked, he flew in to try to help, and he wound up clawing and pecking at Daniel's head, ultimately getting Daniel's blood on his beak, which led to their arrest. Daniel Torres and Johnny Cerna were both ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison.